Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to week 13, the final week of Politics, Power and Resistance. And today, to discuss with me the theme, which is resisting big technology, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali, who's a radical computer scientist and an altogether brilliant mind, and somebody I'm pleased to call a friend. So welcome, Mustafa. Thank you for being here. And I know you've done a lot of work in preparation for this session, so the students are really lucky to have you, as am I, to learn from you on this topic that I have to say I'm kind of a newcomer to many of the questions that I thought it would be interesting to discuss with you today. So the first thing I'd like to ask you is if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your work. And specifically, can you break down in simple terms two of the things that you do, which is decolonial computing and the study of algorithmic racism?
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Alana, for the kind invitation to present some of my ideas and share some thoughts on this topic. Let me begin by saying that I'm a lecturer and convener of the Critical Information Studies Research Group in the School of Computing and Communications at the Open University in the UK. Now, although you've described me as a radical computer scientist, I wouldn't characterize myself in that way. Firstly, I don't want to make the claim that my work is radical in anything, perhaps the original sense of that word. That is, in some sense, as rooted or grounded. And secondly, I don't position myself in relation to computer science, but rather in relation to computing. And for me, the latter needs to be understood as socio-technical in nature, wherein the technical aspects of computing are always already entangled with various social phenomena, including those that are political, economic, cultural, etc. And on this way of looking at things, computer science should really be understood as an abstraction from computing, and fixating on the former, that is, on computer science, can obscure critical engagement with the latter. Now, in my earlier work, I've drawn on various strands of critical theory, including critical race philosophy and decolonial thought, to mount critique of various computing and ICT phenomena, that's information and communication technologies. More recently, I have reoriented my critical frame somewhat to engage more specifically with the entanglements of political economy, political ecology, and even political theology in relation to phenomena like transhumanism, the history and ethics of AI, internet governance, and big data. Now, in an extended conference abstract published in 2014, followed by a short journal paper published 2 years later in 2016, the latter of which is perhaps my most cited publication, I attempted to set out the case for what I refer to as a decolonial computing as one of the ideas that you mentioned in opening. Now, to understand what is meant by that term, I think it's necessary to appreciate that computing was, and I suggest it remains, entangled with colonialism and imperialism. Now, while recognizing that the history of computing, like other histories, is a contested terrain, and duly acknowledging the entanglement of history with geography and both with power, it is a fact that computers, programming, artificial intelligence, the internet, and ICTs all emerged in the West, primarily Britain and the United States, against the backdrop of inter-European military conflict, as the Second World War, and post-war ideological conflict, the Cold War, both of which were relationally entangled with colonized populations along what African American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois referred to as the color line. In fact, the entanglement of computing with imperialism and colonialism go further back than World War II to the development of the analytical and difference engines by the industrialist and inventor Charles Babbage in the early decades of the 19th century and during the hegemony of British Empire. But bringing the discussion up to the present, let's consider resource extraction, for example, in the Congo, which has gone on for centuries and which continues to power the global north, commencing with the extraction of copper for computing systems during the Cold War, and more recently, cobalt for lithium-ion batteries and coltan for mobile devices. And tracking supply chains and the operating logic of racial capitalism affords us an insight into the coloniality of computing as resources, patterns of consumption, and the production of waste, often referred to as e-waste, create circuits involving the core and periphery of the world system. And in this connection, it's encouraging to see recent scholarship exploring the political economy and political ecology of the AI supply chain and cognate developments. Now, although colonialism as a project of European political domination involving settlement formally ended, and when I say formally ended, I'm talking largely formally ended, with the national liberation and independence or so-called decolonization movements of the 1960s, the modernity which colonialism engendered persists, albeit transformed under the condition of postmodernity, which has meant the persistence of certain sedimented colonial ways of knowing and being, that is, colonial epistemology and ontology, based on systems of categorization, classification, and taxonomization, and the embedding of these in practices, artifacts, and technologies. It's these legacy systemic structuring logics, whether they're ontological, epistemological, cultural, political, economic, etc., what is referred to as coloniality, which persist in the contemporary post-colonial era, notwithstanding the formal end of colonialism. On this basis, decolonial computing, at least as set out in those two early papers from a decade ago, decolonial computing commits to interrogating computing and related ICT phenomena from a perspective informed by critical race theory, critical race philosophy, and decolonial thought, where the latter is held to foreground considerations of what is referred to as the body politics, or who, and the geopolitics, or where, of knowing and being. Ethically and politically, decolonial computing turns about what might be described as a preferential option for thinking through conceptual frameworks emerging from the periphery, the margins, the borders of the modern colonial world system, with a view to effecting compensatory, reparational action vis-a-vis the legacy systemic effects of historical colonialism that persist in this post-colonial era. Now, researchers and practitioners adopting a decolonial computing perspective are required at a minimum to do the following. Firstly, consider their geopolitical and body political orientation when designing, building, researching, or theorizing about computing and ICT phenomena. And secondly, embrace what is referred to as the decolonial option as a political ethical stance, attempting to think through what it might mean to design and build and govern computing and ICT systems with and for those situated at the peripheries of the world system, informed by the ways of thinking and knowing, the epistemologies located at such sites, and with a view to undermining the asymmetry of local global power relationships. Now, in later work, largely explored through invited talks and some keynotes, I've taken a much more pessimistic view on the prospects for decolonial computing in suggesting that even if the relationship between computing and coloniality is historically contingent, and that decolonizing computing is thereby possible in principle, in its dominant or hegemonic contemporary form, computing does not merely carry the legacy systemic traces of colonialism, but is fundamentally driven by a relentless colonizing logic, an idea I'll come back to later in our discussion, hopefully. I have a book chapter entitled Internet Decolonized, a methodologically dystopian perspective coming out later this year, which sets out my more recent thinking on this issue. Now, complementing my work on decolonial computing, and as briefly sketched out in an abstract for a conference presentation delivered in 2016, again, around the same time that I was floating the idea of a decolonial computing, I proposed the idea of algorithmic racism. And this was essentially a theoretical construct for understanding processes of racial formation, or if you like, racialization, within the context of Western historical experience in relation to its others or others. In contrast to later thinking about algorithmic racism as explored by the likes of Ruha Benjamin in her 2019 book, Race After Technology, and by others, which tends to focus on how algorithms can embed and reproduce racism, I traveled in the opposite direction, attempting to think about racism and race making itself in algorithmic terms, with a view to disclosing continuities masked by transitions between different conceptualizations or framings, which I describe as iterations of racism in different historical epochs. Most significantly, in the transition from modernity to the contemporary postmodern, post-colonial, and allegedly post-human era. I should state that in arguing for racism or racialization as algorithmic, I'm mobilizing the algorithm here metaphorically with a view to seeing what critical work it might enable to be done. I've elaborated on the notion of algorithmic racism in a few papers, most notably a journal article published in 2019 and a book chapter in 2021. But the basic idea sketched out, I guess, a decade ago has continued to inform my thinking about transhuman and post-human, including AI phenomena ever since. That's rather, I guess, a rather long answer to your rather short question at the outset.
That's okay. I mean, I think it's obviously really, really interesting. And I also think that students will at least have some familiarity from the studying that we've done together of some of the terms that you've introduced. So I presume there's going to be maybe less familiarity with terms like posthumanism or even postmodern or transhumanism and algorithmic in the sense that you're using it metaphorically rather than thinking about the algorithm like students will be familiar from thinking about social media. However, they are familiar, or we are familiar in this class, with the concept of coloniality that we've been doing a lot of work on. So I think there'll be, possibilities to draw links. And what I also thought was great was that you mentioned various papers and book chapters that you've written. So if you provide me a list of those things, then I'll also share them with the students and with the other people who'll be watching this video, no doubt, and who'll be very interested to be able to read some more of your research. So yeah, so that's great. So really the reason that I was interested in grabbing you for this class was because, as students will know, I've been very anti-artificial intelligence this semester, and I've been trying to encourage people to, not rely on it. And I think that's actually really worked. I actually think, despite all of the hand-wringing about, the student use of I think many students are skeptical of it and critical of it. And that's definitely come to the fore in the kinds of discussions that we've had in class. But I wanted to get a little bit behind the hysteria or the moral panic or the kind of, the way it's discussed, particularly in education, and to think, with you, because of the legacy that you've just introduced us to a kind of a critical approach to so-called artificial intelligence. So obviously, so-called artificial intelligence seems to be treated as though it is too big to fail from an economic point of view. And as such, it seems to be everywhere. It's being pushed by private and public institutions as the way to make work more efficient and as tools for research, for example. So can you tell us what is meant by AI? How did it emerge? Who are the main players behind it, do you think? And what are its benefits, possibly? And as you see them, the main problems with it?
Okay, so well, regarding the emergence of AI, let's start there perhaps. I want to point to another journal article. This one is not solely authored, but it's multiply authored by myself and five colleagues who were involved in a Mellon seminar organized at Cambridge University a few years back. The article is entitled Histories, note the plural, Histories of Artificial Intelligence, a Genealogy of Power, and it was published, I think, 3 years ago in 2023. I'm drawing attention to this article because, as we argued there, there's a need to develop, and I'm quoting just a line from it, there's a need to develop a new perspective on AI that moves beyond conventional origin myths that AI was invented at Dartmouth in the summer of 1956, or by the mathematician, arguable founder, or at least one founder of computing, and involved in the Bletchley Park work on code breaking during the Second World War. I'm talking about the figure of Alan Turing, right, in 1950. So that's 5 years or 6 years before the Dartmouth conference took place, where the term artificial intelligence was coined. And all of this with a view to reframing contemporary critique by establishing what we might describe as plural genealogies that situate AI within deeper histories and broader geographies. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier about, attending to history and geography as entangled, and both of them as entangled with power. Right. So, I mean, in the contemporary period, there's a tendency to point to this thing called AI, whatever that means, and we'll have a think about that in a moment. Increasingly as a marketing term, right? And that's not wrong, right? So, a marketing term, why was it coined? Well, essentially to solicit research funding. And this certainly, I mean, this narrative isn't wrong, right? It goes back to John McCarthy. That's essentially why he coined it. He wanted to get the money in order to do the work, at least as he and those around him saw it. Yeah, what is artificial intelligence, right? This is the meat of the question and potentially of this discussion, right? Now, notwithstanding its contested genealogy and the fact that there actually may be multiple genealogies, especially as we entangle that with geography and power, but historically speaking, I think at least three different kinds or flavors of AI can be identified. Right? So, firstly, what is often referred to as symbolic or GoFi, that's good old-fashioned AI. Right? And this involves formal representation and logic-based reasoning. And you see this in the development in the 70s of things referred to as expert systems, right? For various things. It could be medical diagnosis, uh, to do with drug choice and various other kinds of developments. But fundamentally, the two key components there were to have something like a knowledge-based system, and then to have some form of logical inference mechanism that could interrogate that knowledge base in relation to some questions that were put to the system, right? So this is fundamentally turning about knowledge representation and logic. A second development is, I mean, it comes a bit later, and largely, although not exclusively, pioneered by an Australian researcher called Rodney Brooks. And this is the field of what is known as reactive robotic systems, which are physically embodied, environmentally situated in the world, and modeled on biological life forms, right? I mean, Google Rodney Brooks and reactive robotics, you'll see the kind of stuff that he was developing. Also at MIT, right? They were doing a lot of research. I think Brooks was there for a while anyway. And then thirdly, and this is probably the one that, is garnering all the attention at the moment, are what are referred to as connectionist systems or neural networks. Right? And these are modeled on the biological brain. And I guess it's the latter kind of phenomena, along with statistical machine learning systems that tend to be the focus of contemporary research, and obviously the discussions about AI within various domains and in, if you like, popular and public consciousness. However, I need to point out that even if we restrict ourselves to the latter, that is, just to machine come deep learning systems, and I'm here thinking about things like the large language model based kind of chatbot tools such as ChatGPT, etc. I mean, even if we just restrict ourselves to these, right? They can be understood in various ways, right? I mean, even if we're just saying, like, okay, there are these three broad flavors, and we're just going to fixate on the third flavor, right? So it's connectionist, neural network, machine come deep learning type systems. But even these systems, there's not just one way of understanding them, right? And in this connection, I think it's really quite telling that a 2023 policy report entitled, and here it comes, a literature review of AI metaphors and why they matter for policy. It pointed to at least
Wow.
55 different ways of understanding what might be meant by AI.
Mm.
55. While the October 27 issue, I mean, from last year, right? So this is October 27, 2025 issue of the tech magazine Wired was dedicated to, and I quote, this is the headline for that issue, AI of 1,000 faces. They didn't explore 1,000 faces, but 17 different takes on this term, right? So even amongst the kind of the tech bros and the tech files, even they're recognizing that, hey, there isn't a single lane on which to travel in terms of understanding what AI is. Now, what should we make of all of this? So, for my part, I think it suggests that AI isn't one thing, but many. Okay. I mean, earlier we already saw about it being a marketing term, in relation to John McCarthy's original pitch in 1956 at the Dartmouth conference. But interestingly, young scholar Yarden Katz, in his 2020 book, Artificial Whiteness, The Politics and Ideology of Artificial Intelligence, refers to what he describes as the nebulous and shifting character of AI. But rather than unpacking this in terms of social imaginaries and metaphors, Katz opts to think about it in relation to white supremacy and racial capitalism, more specifically in terms of political economy and ideology. Now, while I think that framing has traction, I mean, I'm not dismissing it by any stretch, I'm wary of fixating on materialist political economy on account of the tendency to occlude, perhaps even erase, other complementary perspectives, including political ecology and political theology. And in 2024, so that's a couple of years ago now, I published a journal article entitled AI and / as racialized political theology, which attempted to set out such a complementary perspective. More recently, I've turned to thinking about AI as a fetish, right? Drawing on the work of the late anarchist anthropologist David Graeber and that of anthropologist and political ecologist Alf Hornborg, who's based at the university, I think Lund University in Sweden. One way of thinking about a fetish, and this obviously goes back to Karl Marx, is as a means by which to treat relations between people as relations between things. The classic example, obviously, being money. I'm also interested in exploring what I refer to as, it's maybe a bit of a cheeky term, idolatry. Idolatry, right? That is AI as an idol, again, drawing on political theology. But this is a project that's a little bit underdeveloped at the moment. But let me comment on the term artificial intelligence itself, right? So not how to understand it, but the very term. Now, in her 2021 book, Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Cost of Artificial Intelligence, Kate Crawford argues that, and I quote, AI is neither artificial nor intelligent, but rather both embodied and material, made from natural resources, fuel, human labor, infrastructures, logistics, histories, and classifications, end of quote. Now, for my part, I think she's right, but also wrong. On the one hand, I think she is right insofar as I concur with the view that AI as a socio-technical assemblage is indeed embodied and material. But on the other hand, I think she's wrong because as a socio-technical assemblage, AI is both artificial in the sense of being artifactual, that is, something brought into being through human action, and it's also intelligent insofar as the vast data sets upon which it is trained, not to mention the human intervention to scrutinize and correct the outputs generated by such systems, what is often known as RLHF or reinforcement learning with human feedback, both involve human intelligence. In short, I'm suggesting that human intelligence is at work in such systems, yet obscured through a fetishizing of the socio-technical assemblage as a purely technical system. Elsewhere, I've begun to frame this, and it's maybe a little bit dense, but I mean, at the end of the day, this has been recorded and you have a transcript and people can go away and have a think about this. So elsewhere, I've begun to frame this as intelligence appropriation, or IA, of those in subordinate positions of power for purposes of developing and deploying artificial intelligence, or AI, that enables intelligence amplification, or IA, of those in dominant positions of power. In short, and this may sound slightly crazy, it's IA for AI for IA, right? And I suggest this way of thinking about AI is consistent with and an elaboration of the idea of algorithmic racism that I referred to earlier. But in your question, you referred to AI as a tool, right? And I would want to dispute that. I mean, I wish AI was a tool, right? I'm hopeful, and hopefully my hope isn't delusional, that at some point in the future, based on various forms of resistance and other action, AI can be transformed into a tool. But I'm suggesting it's not currently a tool, and that the trajectory is not instrumentalist in the sense that we might think about a tool, such as a screwdriver or a hammer, for example. So for my part, and as stated already, I see it as an increasingly pervasive socio-technical assemblage. And in this connection, in 2018, Kate Crawford, once again, and a colleague, Vlad Anjola, they presented this project, which is a visual project, called The Anatomy of an AI System, thereby invoking the body, right? The idea of an anatomy. And this was an anatomical map of human labor, data, and planetary resources for the Amazon ecosystem. And more recently, now I think this work was done 1 or 2 years ago, the Catalan-based Estampa Collective presented a cartography of generative AI, and you can find these on the web. I mean, both of these are public resources, and I can't recommend to your students the importance of at least taking a look at these resources, right? It's literally mind-blowing and mind-expanding, right? And very, very revealing. So such mappings for me, I mean, these are just crucial, right? Insofar as they draw out the importance, if not necessity, of attending to the political economy once again and the political ecology of AI in terms of exploitation of so-called ghost work in data annotation, content moderation, but also the extractivism involved in relation to establishing and maintaining what has been referred to as the base or resource layer in the so-called silicon stack, the top of which sits AI, if you like. Whether we are talking here about rare earth mineral mining, fossil fuels to power hyperscale data centers, or the water required to cool the processes that make up the latter in terms of compute power. Now, another part of your question related to who are the main players behind AI, right? And here I think there's a rather unfortunate tendency to think about this in terms of Silicon Valley tech corporations run by rather obnoxious tech bros, many of whom are white supremacist and Zionist in orientation, right? I tend to think that this is a mistake insofar as it obscures the entanglement of such corporations with states, whether we are talking about the United States, China, or elsewhere. And I recently delivered an invited talk, actually it was just a few days ago, at Cambridge University in England, exploring this entanglement in relation to the US State Department launching the so-called Pax Silica initiative, which focuses on securing global supply chains for AI development and deployment in relation to an emerging, and I quote, geopolitical consensus that economic security is national security and national security is economic security, end of quote. And that's directly lifted from the US State Department website for the Pax Silica initiative. Now, finally, regarding the question of the benefits and harms of AI, I'm afraid that I simply don't think it's possible to answer that question until we agree what we are talking about. As I tried to argue previously, there are rather a lot of different ways in which AI can be understood, not to mention different types or kinds or flavors of AI deployed in different contexts and in pursuit of quite different goals.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I've learned so much just in the kind of 10 minutes you spoke there, and so many different avenues for research. But what becomes very clear, particularly from the last part of what you said, is that notwithstanding the fact that researchers like Kate Crawford and others who you mentioned and yourself have been doing this kinds of research, and I'm definitely going to go and look up the cartography and the anatomy that you mentioned and share those with the students, what's very interesting is that universities, so just thinking about the context that we're all working and studying within, notwithstanding the fact that they're supposed to be institutions of research that promote researchers like Crawford and others to go away and do this research, are fixated on one particular very narrow understanding of what AI is from their perspective, which seems to align with the kind of economic statist, money profit making version of AI, and really promoting that, which says a lot, I think, about what our institutions of learning have become. So, as I always say to the students, ask questions of your institutions, right? So, when we're talking about resistance, we also have to think about what we need to resist within these institutions. So, indeed, thinking beyond this idea, well, it's just a tool for your learning, it's just a tool for research, it's something that you can use if you use it transparently, etc. We need to dig a lot deeper and actually use our critical thinking skills, when asking those questions. So this is really, really, really useful. Lots of avenues, I think, for us to go down. Okay, so I guess I kind of answered the next question myself, but I'm sure you have a lot more to say about it, because I'm really interested in this question of why AI is being so aggressively pushed today, when only a few years ago universities were really panicking about it and saying, you've got to treat this really seriously, you've got to discourage students, you've got to look at it like plagiarism. But now, for example, our university has signed up, I believe, Microsoft ambassadors who are going to kind of be the vanguard of the promotion of AI. So they're kind of really jumping on board with these companies to promote it quite aggressively. And I heard recently that La Trobe University in Victoria has become an AI first university, which apparently means that you're supposed to first draft your essays with AI and then correct it or something. So I'm just wondering what you think about all of that.
Hmm. Okay, so I'm just going to put my cards on the table. I mean, this is I'm aware of these developments. I have colleagues at my institution who are attending to these developments critically, trying to see where there's space for wiggle room, pushback, resistance, etc. And there, a range of voices, like you've said, at one time it was digital first, right? Fascinating that you say La Trobe has gone AI first. I'm like, wow. If you take the view that AI is a colonizing socio-technical assemblage, it's like, okay, so we're going colonizing socio-technical assemblage first, right? We want to roll colonialism out. We want to embrace colonialism, in a kind of like Marco Rubio fashion at the Munich Security Conference, right? We need to recolonize. Colonialism is good for you, right? Um, but this isn't an area that, for my sins, perhaps, that which is, I guess, somewhat embarrassing, given that I'm supposed to be an educator and an academic in a university institution. But generally, I've not attended to these kind of developments. I try to keep abreast of them and speak to my colleagues who are attending to them in relation to education. But my focus tends to be elsewhere. And I hope you're sort of like allowing me to kind of maybe just move the direction of travel
Sure.
where I'd like to take it,
Yeah.
and hopefully it's complementary anyway, right?
Yeah.
Everything is entangled. Everything is entangled, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, part of your question, I guess, was why do you think AI is being so aggressively pushed today, right? And I just want to pause there, right? Why is it being so aggressively pushed? And I would suggest for different reasons. And largely depending on whether one is focusing on so-called global north or the core of the world system, or the global south, or the periphery of this system, right? And the system, let's just think about it for the moment as racial capitalism, something like that. So on my reading, AI tends to be deployed for what might be described as biopolitical purposes. So just, kind of crudely, this is to do with population management and control in global north contexts. Right? And this largely involves what has been referred to as surveillance capitalism, right? Like gathering vast data through the kind of data trails that we all generate through our use of mobile phones, laptops, pads, various interactions with what's called the Internet of Things as we move through electronic turnstiles and the rest of it, right? All of these generate data trails. These are all gathered, these are all centralized, and then fundamentally these data sets become sites to enact data mining using that metaphor, that mining metaphor, right? So this is for purpose of extraction, attempting to detect patterns, and on the basis of those detected patterns, make predictions. In the past, for example, in Zuboff's book, I think it's called Surveillance Capitalism, um, she talks about this in relation to the sale of prediction products to advertisers who then project back to users or consumers of advertising, creating a feedback loop, right? So it's like a revolving door between the user or the consumer and these various platforms, harvesting this data, mining this data, and then feeding this data back to us. And what's really quite scary is if you think about what's going on here, insofar as predictions are being generated on the basis of these detected patterns, this can be thought about, and this isn't an idea that I can claim to have originated, but I pretty much subscribe to it. This affects something like a colonizing of the future or a collapse of futures, right? Because effectively what you're doing is you're creating a feedback loop, which is revolving around more of the same, right? There are certain parameters that are tagged, and there are certain, if you like, cost functions that are wired into these machine come deep learning systems. And largely, whether you want to think about this in relation to profit maximization, or you want to think about this more carcerally in relation to control of populations, again, under racial capitalism, these are all entangled, right? The line of the human, the extraction and exploitation of labor, the maintaining of people in a kind of subordinate position, etc. Yeah, so that's really about, and this is about global. I'm just talking about the global north here, right? I haven't even traveled to the periphery or the borders of the world system, because there, um, in those contexts, a fortiori, for example, Palestine, AI has been deployed, but it's also been developed in pursuit not so much of biopolitical ends, not so much in relation to management of populations, but rather in pursuit of necropolitical ends, right? And that's just the extermination of certain populations considered uh, surplus to requirements, right? And this builds on the work of obviously the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe, I think it was a 2007, maybe I have that date wrong, paper, which he subsequently developed into a book. And I think that that duality, and I'm not suggesting it's a stark binary, right, of the biopolitical on the one hand in the global north, and the necropolitical on the other in the global south. Because what about the global south in the global north, right? Because of migration and the rest of it. And actually, somebody asked me that question at that Cambridge talk that I delivered a few days ago. It's like, well, but what about the fact that you've got this cross movement between populations, largely due to economic migration as a result of war,
And
asylum
also, I would,
seeking.
sorry to interrupt, but I'd
No,
also
no, go
add
ahead, go
for
ahead.
indigenous peoples here on this
Absolutely,
continent, right? So
absolutely,
it's a very clear
absolutely.
example. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Right, right. No, so yeah, so we need to complicate the picture, but I think that um, whether it's a binary or a dyad or whatever, these are two poles that I think can do useful work when we put them into conversation with each other, and that's an idea. Hopefully, maybe I'll try to pick up a little bit later in the conversation. Um, but in addition to these, what I'm suggesting are biopolitical and necropolitical drivers, right? So population management on the one hand, and population elimination on the other. I think there are, and I've mentioned this already, I guess, there are obvious political economic forces in play. But I mean, just for my part, I'm, extremely wary of economistically reductive readings that suggest AI is ultimately about making money for the few. I'm not suggesting that isn't a driver. I just think that there are bigger fish to fry, or at least other fish to fry along with the economy.
Yes, definitely. I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole which kind of is beyond the constraints of this particular class. So I would definitely agree that narrow economistic readings of many things, for example, in my case, in my work with regards to race, are always very constraining. And in fact, the reason that I asked you to come and speak to this class is because of the very fascinating interview you did about your paper on the links to political theology with Adnan Hussein on his show. So I'll also link to that for the students. So that's kind of a much more broad ranging conversation, which was absolutely fascinating. I learned so much from that one as well. Okay, so I think you've already gone a little bit in this direction in your last answer. But in one of the readings that I set for the students, which is some articles on the link between AI and colonialism, the writer Karen Howe warns that the impact of AI is repeating the patterns of colonial history as she sees it. So, can you explain what you think she means from your perspective? Because I do see some overlaps in what you've just been saying.
Cool. Okay, so I mean, Karen Howe set out her position, at least as far as I'm aware, originally in an article for the MIT Technology Review. Maybe this is the one that you've assigned to your students. Um, and I think it was entitled The Problems AI Has Today Go Back Centuries. And it was published in 2020, I think. Yeah. And in that article, she states the following, and this is just a very short quote from it. She says, though historical colonialism may be over, its effects still exist today. This is what scholars term coloniality. It's an idea we've already discussed. And this is the idea that modern day power imbalances between races, countries, rich and poor, and other groups are extensions of the power imbalances between colonizer and colonized. Now, in terms of the impact of AI repeating patterns of colonial history, I suggest thinking about this in at least two related ways. So, firstly, that insofar as contemporary machine come deep learning systems, especially those based on large language models or LLMs, and resulting in what has been referred to as generative AI, kind of chat GPT and other types of system. Well, insofar as these are trained on vast data sets that embed the aforementioned historical power relations, whether these are racialized, gendered, classed, etc., I would argue that AI functions as something like an amplifying of the structural violence associated with the establishment and the maintenance of the modern colonial world system. And in this connection, I'm pretty much on the same page as my colleague and occasional tag team partner, Dan McQuillan, the latter of whom is based at Goldsmiths University in London and who authored the important book, Resisting AI, an Anti-Fascist Approach to Artificial Intelligence in 2022. But secondly, that insofar as AI as a socio-technical assemblage is being pervasively rolled out across various sectors, education, healthcare, welfare, business, and law, not to mention policing, and perhaps most insidiously, warfare. And here I draw attention to the ongoing debate about the development and deployment of so-called lethal autonomous weapon systems or laws. And insofar as AI is increasingly being positioned as critical infrastructure, that is, infrastructure considered necessary for the functioning of the social order, I suggest that AI, at least in this dominant form, is itself colonizing in nature. And in this connection, I build upon an insight from two human computing practitioners, Paul Dorish and Scott Mainwaring, who argued in 2013 that they were talking about a slightly different area then. It was pervasive or ubiquitous computing. And they argued that this was driven by what they referred to as a colonial impulse. right? And this was sketched in a paper that was subsequently building upon this work. I think it was referring to the idea of a post-colonial computing. This was kind of authored by Lily Irani, Kavita Philip, and Dorish himself. And decolonial computing is kind of a response to that work in post-colonial computing in some sense, trying to take it a stage further. Right, so how to bring this together? As I put simply, and I'm not sure if Karen Howe would agree with me on this, right? Because I've not read her book. AI is repeating the patterns of colonial history by reproducing those historical patterns by virtue of being trained on data sets in which those patterns are embedded, but also by virtue of contributing to the pattern of colonial history as its next iteration within what I referred to earlier as algorithmic racism. So I see this kind of repetition of patterns of colonial history as twofold, if that makes sense. Within the tech, and the tech itself as an iteration of the pattern of colonial history.
I don't want to drive this in another direction, but we should have another conversation about whether or not the recalibration of the racial regime could be something that, you know, could fit this as well, because it echoes that for me, this idea of iteration and of a pattern, which is, yeah, this kind of recursivity that Robinson talks about in relation to the racial regime that I've written about. Anyway, but I'll park that there, and that's very interesting. And I think Howe would agree with you, although I think she's possibly more narrowly focused on the colonizing impulse of the tech bros specifically, because that was the area of her research, and you've obviously got a much wider critique. Okay, so you've already foregrounded this a little bit in some of your remarks, but the ongoing genocide in Palestine has obviously highlighted the use of AI-powered weapons and surveillance systems for accelerating the genocide. Israel has presented itself as a leader in the development of such tools, which it's selling to governments around the world. So can you tell us a little bit about the ways, you've already sort of mentioned a little bit, that AI is being used for military and policing purposes, and how do you connect this to the coloniality of AI? So in a sense, this is an opportunity for you to elaborate on some of the comments that you've just been making.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Yeah, so I guess building on what I've argued already regarding what I refer to as the biopolitical and necropolitical deployment of AI, I would suggest that there's something of a revolving door. I think I might have even mentioned this idea earlier in our conversation, right? And I'm suggesting that this revolving door is between the securitized and surveillance-based military-industrial complex, largely based in the global north, and its regional proxies, such as the Zionist settler colonial state of Israel, which is geographically embedded in the global south, in West Asia, right? In this connection, investigative journalist Anthony Lowenstein has explored what he refers to as the Palestine Laboratory in relation to Israel's development and field testing of various technologies for surveillance and targeting in AI-driven war, but also how such technologies, once battle tested, are then exported for sale and redeployment in other contexts, including in policing populations within the global north. And in this connection, I think it would be remiss of me not to mention the extremely important recent work of surveillance and carceral technologies researcher Sarah Fathallah, who has engaged with the work of Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe, who I mentioned earlier, in thinking about the necropolitics of AI in relation to Palestine and beyond. And if you like, I can point you to her work if you drop me a line, and if you want to share that with your students, please obviously feel free to do so. I mean, in this connection, I should also like to plug, if I may, I've already made a rather copious reference to my previous work, but I'd like to plug, if I may, a book coming out towards the end of this year entitled, and it's got an interesting title, at least to me, AI, right? Automated Islamophobia, The Future of AI and Muslims, in which I have contributed, to which I have contributed the opening chapter, which is, I think it's titled something like AI and / as Islamophobia, right? So
That's going to be
yet
interesting.
again,
Yeah, looking forward to that.
well, hopefully, I mean, you give me feedback in due course, see what you think of it. But to bring this all together, I would say if all of this doesn't point to the coloniality of AI, I just don't know what does. I mean, that would be my simple answer to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And students can read. I shared an essay that kind of details the kinds of tools that have been developed and that are used to enact genocide, and it's absolutely horrifying. And I also do recommend Anthony Lowenstein's book. Of course, he's an Australian-based journalist, and many talks that he's given on the subject as well. Okay, well, this has been incredibly useful, but I do have one last question, which is just a simple, simple but not very simple
Oh,
question. Because obviously the title of this course is Politics, Power and Resistance. So we always think about how we
right.
can resist structures of oppression. And so AI, do you think that it's something that's here for good? And or do you think that we can successfully resist it? And obviously, I'm putting out the caveat that you've explained to us that there are many different forms of AI, possibly thousands, as you mentioned. So, parking that for a second, thinking about the kinds of systems that we've been talking about. So, the kinds that are used for death making, the kinds that are used for surveillance and incarceration, and even the kinds that are shifting the way we learn and our ability to learn. What are, given those things, some of the strategies that you would advocate that we, as ordinary citizens, if you like, can engage in when trying to think about how to fight against these tools?
Okay. Right. So I guess maybe earlier when we were discussing whether computing can be decolonized, I suggested that insofar as the relationship between computing and colonialism is historically contingent, i.e., it's not necessary, that decolonizing computing was therefore possible, at least in principle. And insofar as AI is a type of computing, it would seem to follow, perhaps, that AI can be decolonized. But I also refer to mainstream computing being driven by what I've repeatedly referred to during the course of this conversation as something like a colonizing impulse. And I think this certainly applies to AI, at least in its dominant current form. I would argue that this impulse points to a certain technological momentum, if not acceleration, and that if this development is not checked, it will indeed continue to colonize the human and the more than human life worlds. But does this mean that AI is here for good and that its rollout is in some sense inevitable? Well, I would suggest that it's not, but that to effectively resist it and beyond resistance, engage in its abolition or rollback, we are going to need to endorse and enact various oppositional strategies. Now, insofar as I think it is unwise to talk too much about such strategies, given that doing so can result in their co-optation by dominant power, here I think I'm going to confine myself to simply sketching out a few suggestions and outlining an orientation. But before I do that, I want to address an argument about AI that tends to have currency among those on the left, especially among Marxists. And put simply, and at the risk of caricature, they maintain that AI, in its technical aspect, is not the problem. Rather, it's the political economic system within which AI has been developed and that sets the parameters for its development and deployment. In short, the trajectory is the problem. Now, this line of argument turns about the conventional Marxist account of the mode of production or a mode of production as involving the forces of production on the one hand and the social relations of production on the other. The assumption, I suggest, is that AI is a force of production and that a different configuration of social relations, for example, socialist rather than capitalist, would result in a constructive rather rather than destructive use of AI. But I think that argument is suspect insofar as it assumes a certain neutrality to the forces of production. And I simply don't buy that in relation to AI, given its historical entanglements with various forms of violence, whether colonial, eugenicist, racist, or otherwise. And what I would suggest is the intrinsically colonizing impulse of AI as a socio-technical assemblage. I mean, I've repeated this point throughout this conversation. Put simply, I think the Marxist argument falls victim to a certain technocratic and productionist view of things, and that behind both of these lies an insufficiently critical take of the idea of progress itself. But in terms of concrete suggestions for resistance, if not abolition, let me start with education, which is an issue that you have surfaced previously. For my part, I think it's just imperative to gain a basic understanding, once again, of the political economy, the political ecology, and the political theology of AI in relation to the human and more than human costs of this socio-technical project. Education is crucial, but not only for understanding, but also for developing an affective and effective orientation towards this colonial project. In other words, if you like, our emotional comportment and our practical and practical comportment towards this project. After that, there is organized grassroots activism to consider against the rollout of the enabling infrastructure of AI, such as opposition to the building of hyperscale data centers, which are being rolled out anywhere and everywhere. And going even beyond that, direct action physically targeting such infrastructure. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as time goes on. And for me, all of this points to an orientation that I have developed elsewhere, which I refer to as fugitive decolonial Luddism, and which I have also explored. Actually, it was in a journal paper published last year, in relation to what is known as the Butlerian Jihad, which is the backstory to the Dune saga. Dune books originally being authored by Frank Herbert, the science fiction author and a Hugo and Nebula Award winner. And this backstory, the Butlerian Jihad, is fundamentally about a war against the machines, primarily AI. So that's the kind of direction of travel that I'm charting. It ranges, I guess, from get educated through do something with this education, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's so interesting. And that was something else that you discussed quite at some length during your conversation with Adnan. So I'll definitely post that as an addendum to what we've been discussing here today. So, yes, so much food for thought, so many things, definitely to kind of spark us off in many directions. Because I think for many of us, we're feeling, particularly I think for younger people, this discussion of AI as inevitable and, that therefore it needs to be harnessed for good, as though we can just strip it from the colonizing impulse that you've been talking about. It's like, arguing that you could use race or you could use gender for some kind of force for good, where we know that these are oppressive
Or a
structures.
nuclear weapon, right?
Or a
Let's use
nuclear
a nuclear
weapon,
weapon for
indeed.
good,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Well, exactly. But I mean, we do have those arguments. And I do find it quite interesting. I mean, without veering off into a whole other debate, thinking about that Marxist argument that you've been mounting, because some of the people in kind of similar political orbits that we'd be familiar with will be making that argument, particularly with contrasting, let's say, DeepSeek, so the Chinese version of the generative AI, and ChatGPT, or the global north versions that are seen to be nefarious, whereas this one is seen to be like liberatory. And I do think that we definitely have to think about the kinds of questions that you've raised for us when making those rather, dare I say,
Yeah, I
facile
mean,
suggestions.
yeah, just on that point. I was discussing this with my wife a few days ago about, a friend of mine was talking about the possibility of creating an Islamicate GPT, and I'm like, are you for real? I mean, do you know what you're asking here, right?
Mm.
And I mean, you quite rightly just counterpoised, for example, ChatGPT to DeepSeek and the rest of it, right? But I think it's useful to think about this as something like moves within a language game,
Mm.
right? To build on slightly kind of philosophically sophisticated argument of philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. But I think that's quite useful in the sense that, look, that maybe for strategic or even tactical reasons, you might need to engage in that, but
Mm.
that can't be the end
Right.
and the consummation of your strategy, right?
Mm.
It needs to go beyond that because otherwise you get locked in an arms race. And,
Mm.
this discussion of the AI arms race is relentless, right? It's a kind of dialectic that just
Yeah.
ramps up and up and up and up and up and up
Mm.
and up, right? And what is the end game for that, right? I mean, I don't know if in your module or your course you're getting students to engage with science fiction at all. But there's a really good movie from the 1960s called Colossus, the Forbin Project. Maybe you know this?
I haven't seen it
Yes,
now.
no? Okay, right. Homework. Okay. So this is a really interesting movie because it predates a film that maybe some of us are possibly, more familiar with, which is, I think it was called War Games. It came out in the 1980s, right?
Mm.
Like, shall we play tactical thermonuclear war? And it's like some nerdy kid in the US thinks playing just a game online. It's actually potentially launching nuclear strikes, right? Between, I think it was maybe the Soviet Union and the United States.
Mm.
Fortunately, that doesn't happen, right? But the Forbin project is essentially exploring the same kind of thing in the sense that uh, different AI systems are being developed at different sites in the world system. But then and I'm not suggesting this is going to happen, right? But I'm just trying to riff off this as a kind of thought experiment. Um, we could think about these as a kind of an AI arms race move within a language game, right? America develops, Soviets develop, or in our context, China develops. But then at some point, there's a kind of meta move in the sense that the two systems start to kind of like actually work together,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not projecting autonomy or intentionality or
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
sentience or any of that. To me, that's just fetishizing moves
Mm.
yet
Mm-hmm.
again, right? But it's interesting to think about this in terms, at least I think, in terms of thinking that does this define the end point of possible interventions? Or could there be interventions that go beyond AI centrism?
Mm.
And in this connection, once again, referring to the work of my colleague Dan McQuillan, he's been exploring the idea of what he calls decomputing, which is a kind of, it's building on the idea of degrowth, right? So that kind of critique of
Yeah.
the presumption of endless growth within mainstream capitalism, and linking this to this, I think he refers to it as an apparatus rather than an assemblage, but these are cognate terms anyway. And just thinking about what it means to roll back. And I mean, I remember him saying something really nicely. He said, I think we've got enough compute as it is. I don't think we need any more. We just need to use
Yeah.
what we have and possibly even roll back on that if we need it at all.
Yeah.
But we're not having those debates, right? We're not having those debates. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm old enough to remember life before the internet, and it was okay.
It
In
was
fact, it was pretty
fine.
good.
It was great. I mean, not to sound old and fuddy-duddy and nostalgic, but I often say this to my daughter. I mean, if you made an appointment with somebody at 2 o'clock on the steps of, in my case, I remember I had a friend who was terminably late, and we'd always make the appointment,
That,
let's
that was
say,
probably me. That was probably me.
with somebody else who shall remain nameless, and we'd make the appointment at 2 o'clock at the steps of the old, steps of the old building of the LSC. It was always the same place, and he'd
Mm,
always be at least 45 minutes late. But
right.
of course, we
So you
didn't
could
have a
sit in a
mobile
plot by him,
phone.
right?
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
right.
But you just have to wait because you knew that he would eventually turn up, but you couldn't ring each other, you couldn't send a message and all of that. But there was something about, I just liked this friend so much that I wanted to wait for him to turn up because I knew
Yeah.
we'd have a great time after he arrived. So that was the point. And that was not, oh, I could make better use of those 45 minutes if I had my mobile phone in my hand and I could go and do something else. So this whole idea of having to maximize our time. No, this was just, we would probably today call it, well, that was dead time because I didn't have a phone to
Mm,
scroll on. I just had to stand there and wait and watch the people passing by. There was something so absolutely lovely about that. that we have today lost. I mean, we've all lost it. I mean, another thing I have heard, however, of certain schools resisting the use of computing and online systems. They've just decided we're just not going to go down that route. And I think that is quite a simple step that could be taken. But because there's been, to come back to the question of aggressively pushing these systems, because of ultimately, I think, the profit motive, but also the colonizing impulse, because these things do also go together. They're not disentangleable from each other. Then many schools, just in my own case, when I know my daughter's school, absolutely everything is done through Google. Rarely is a pen taken
Right.
up, you know. So it's really, really distressing when we think about what that means for the future of learning.
Mm.
Anyway, thank you so much for this marvelous conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. I've got a lot of things to go and look up. And yeah, is there anything that you'd like to add before we call it a night?
No, I think I've exhausted everything that I could hopefully share, hopefully of some constructive benefit for your students. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
just very honored and humbled to be able to share these ideas with you.
Thank you so much.